And now, from a solar-powered shed in Rockland County, New York, a man who spent 3 hours trying to rewire a ceiling fan. Ladies and gentlemen, a full fool, Pete Dominic. Thank you very much, Pete Coe is off tonight. He couldn't get it together, and so we're going to have some serious conversations about his dedication to doing this each and every day, the opening of the show. I mean, listen, what do I not pay you for, Pete? For goodness sake. No, he really felt bad. He's like, I'm so sorry. Like, every day he does it, and we love it. And if you don't do it, it's totally fine, my brother. Go give him thanks at Pete COEVO on Twitter. Well, if you're listening to this on Monday, and I hope you are, I hope you had a great weekend. Welcome to the first full week of March. Spring would seem imminent. I think that's fair to say, although I feel like we still haven't had winter, which is pretty sad and depressing here in the Northeast. But I'm very glad to have you listening to today's episode of Stand Up, where my very special guest is Russia expert, Putin expert, finance expert, Bill Browder, who's been on the show several times before. Always a really excellent, intense, brilliant, super important voice. The author of Red Notice, a true story of high finance, murder, and one man's fight for justice. And also, most recently, Freezing Order, a true story of money laundering, murder, and surviving Vladimir Putin's wrath. So good, and we had a great conversation. I did not get Mara Quint on the show, but you know who did? Maddie C. Maddie C is interviewing all of our favorite guests on his podcast, What Am I Making?, which you should go over and subscribe to. And by the way, if you host a podcast or you do something creative or you want me to plug something that you think people would enjoy, I'd love to hear from you. So just reach out, standupwithpete@gmail.com. We get Dr. Barry Hummel, who's back with Pops on Hops, which he hosts with his daughter. It's so good. And also Zach Lewis hosts a podcast for soccer dads. If you're a soccer dad, you'll absolutely love it. I've listened to it. It's great. The Soccer Dad Pod. Zach and a couple of his soccer dad buddies host that. And Zach's a really cool cat. He's a regular listener and subscriber to the show. So, yeah, if you want me to plug something, not that any of them asked, but I'm a fan and supporter of all the work that they do, and I'd love to hear from you. So let me know. Also, if you're on Facebook and you are a gardener, it's that time of year, folks. We start sharing ideas, complaints, solutions, problems. The Stand Up Garden Club has just over 1,000 members, so check that out. You could just request, and I will approve of your membership in the Stand Up Garden Club. Well, I hope you got out this weekend. If you did, send me your pictures of vitamin N. I hope that you heard the weekend special. I posted what I described sarcastically as a feel-good chat about how chaotic our gun laws have become thanks to Trump, Clarence Thomas, and the rest of America who think total access to guns for everyone is more important than children's lives. That was a weekend special with the great Professor Eric Siegel joining us on the state of gun laws in America. That was really good. If you haven't listened, go check it out. But let's talk about the weekend in news before we get to Bill Browder, which is coming up at about 21 minutes. That starts. Let's see, a couple things I wanted to mention and play for you. First of all, Friday night you had Real Time with Bill Maher. It was Russell Brand versus John Heilman, and it was a real controversial conversation because Russell Brand went after John Heilman's employer, MSNBC, and he wouldn't even let John Heilman speak. It was pretty rude and a ridiculous argument because it was all about Fox News versus MSNBC. I'm not even going to play it for you. It was so pathetic, but I only mention it because there is so much of this comparison between the cable networks. And I have a lot to say and a lot of thoughts about that. They are not even remotely similar other than covering some of the same genre of issues. And they call themselves news and so on, but they're all so different. Their editorial standards, their reputations, their credibilities, their levels of accuracy, their viewpoints. But Fox News is way, way out on an island, far, far away from MSNBC and CNN. That is my strong opinion. I'm happy to argue with anybody about that. But we found out through this whole Dominion lawsuit, that is like a whole nother ball game. in almost every other news agency or media outlet in the country, if you said to your colleagues that you did not believe what you were saying on the air, then you would be fired. I mean, if it was in print, if there were records of it, which there now are with so many of the top names at Fox News. And most recently, the New York Times got more and a big, big story that probably, I think, enough people aren't paying attention, but it's an addition, and that can confuse people, of what we learned about what Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson were saying to each other and other executives and Rupert Murdoch. Now we find out that Brett Baer, who is supposed to be this serious newscaster, that I've never given him that credit. He's always been nice to me. I know him. We follow each other on Twitter, so I've tried not to be a total dick to him. But, I mean, the gloves are off now. The guy is on the record of saying that maybe they should reverse the call because Mr. Trump's campaign, the call in the election, maybe they should reverse the call because his campaign was angry and listeners, viewers were angry. I mean, he should have to, his entire reputation should be disgraced. He shouldn't be in serious company with any of the rest of them. They shouldn't be rubbing shoulders at somebody's book party or some award show. It is just absolutely disgraceful what Brett Baer and Martha McCallum read this story inside the panic at Fox News after the 2020 election. It's absolutely wild, and I think not getting nearly enough attention. But the idea that Russell Brand or anybody else is trying to equivocate Fox News to anywhere else, to me personally, I think that's dangerous. I think it's wildly inaccurate, and I think it's pretty stupid. But maybe you don't. Happy to hear from you. And if you don't, I'll give you a call. I'll give you a call and talk with you about that one. And then I'll tape it and I'll share it with everybody and you can have your voice heard. How about it? No one's calling, are they? No, probably not. All right, I'm done ranting. I usually don't rant here on the podcast, but I got pretty worked up about that because I just tweeted something about it over the weekend, and Rex Chapman, about Russell Brand and John Howman. Rex Chapman has like 1.5 million Twitter followers, and he retweeted me, which was cool, I guess, but it went nuts. And I've been getting crazy replies from people all weekend long about it. So I've been thinking about it, and it is an important issue, which is why I certainly wanted to bring it up, this comparison and Fox News, and certainly this new development about Brett Baer and Martha McCallum. It matters a lot. The other big thing to me over the weekend that I paid a lot of attention to was Chris Rock's stand-up special on Saturday night, where Chris Rock was taping a live special in Baltimore on Netflix, which stand-up comics don't ever do and should never do. And I think that was a mistake and a bad stunt, because I think he messed up a lot. I think he was nervous, as you would be. I mean, it's impossible. Usually stand-up specials, you do a couple of shows, maybe 3 or 4 shows. You wear the same outfit, different audiences. You can take the best versions of your joke. That's what I did in Utah back in November, and that'll be out. I don't know when that'll be out, but on Dry Bar on YouTube. But Chris Rock wanted to do it live, and maybe because he wanted to say what he said, of course, about the dispute with him and Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith. But he finally addressed the Oscars slap from almost a year ago and made Netflix history on Saturday. It was their first live global streaming event at all. And the reviews are very, very mixed. One of my favorite black writers, Michael Harriot. Why is Chris Rock still talking about the slap? Sure, he was publicly humiliated and subjected to violence, but it was a year ago. Why should Jada feel uncomfortable for something she didn't do? Will has moved on. Chris should stop dwelling in the past. This tweet is about Florida. So that was, I think, the smartest tweet as a result about Florida not teaching African-American history. Christopher Boozy writes, Will Smith smacked Chris Rock, not Jada Smith. So instead of focusing on Will Smith, he took shots at Jada Smith. Again, he came off as a small and angry little man. Chris is also a black guy. One more black guy, Torre, writes, Chris Rock's set featured an attack on PC culture, and everyone is too quick to be a victim, said wokeness is BS, said abortion is murder, and laughed about how dark Draymond Green is. It's a pretty right-wing outlook on the world. That set would fit on Fox News. Well, I don't know. I think you're minimizing it a little bit, Torre. I mean, or a lot. Black feminist Uju Anya, actually don't know who she is, just says she's a professor and identifies as a black feminist. She says Netflix keeps screwing over subscribers. They cancel hit shows people actually want to watch and give Chris Rock millions of dollars to prove Will Smith was right to slap him. Critical race sociologist and PhD Crystal Fleming writes, I think the reason why Chris Rock's bit about the slap wasn't funny is that he didn't actually share in any deep way how he felt about the whole ordeal beyond unprocessed anger. Instead, He reverted back to disrespecting Jada again, and he threw the word bitch around. Very sad. David Dennis Jr. The funniest thing about the Chris Rock stand-up is he had a whole year to stick the landing on the Will and Jada jokes, but he's still so worked up over a dude slapping him a year ago, he messed up the joke. Jim Gaffigan. Like most comedians, I'm continuously grateful for the existence of Chris Rock. Thank you, comedy gods. Jim Gaffigan, white comedian who's very, very famous, respected. He liked it. Flea of the Red Hot Chili Peppers just tweeted, I love Chris Rock. Black female comedian Lonnie Love. I don't expect my other fellow comics who are not black women to understand the complex issues of some of the Chris Rock set. They have not had to endure the issue of sexism and racism from an industry that doesn't understand you as a black woman. Hashtag Grace. How about one more? Conscious Lee at The Conscious Lee. Chris Rock is that black friend that white liberals covet because he plays into racial pathology with humor, which makes them better than their conservative counterparts. Oh, that's interesting. I'd love to know what you guys think if you watch the special. If you didn't watch the whole special, then maybe just watch the ending where it was the most controversial, obviously, take. It seems to have gotten a lot of folks who I respect divided. And I'm kind of focused on the comedy world and black folks. And then within that, black comedians and their reactions and the kind of cultural commentators that I like and respect. I'm definitely going to be talking with people like Jay Alcovan and Ophir Eisenberg and Christian Finnegan about it, as well as a whole bunch of other folks. My friend Dr. Jason Johnson. I want to ask Chrissy Greer and others about it, but a lot of mixed reviews. I definitely had some genuine laughs during it, but I was uncomfortable when he was talking about his daughters, and I didn't really love the way he handled the Will Smith thing. There were some really funny jokes when he said Will Smith hit him and he could hear Summertime ringing in his ears. Like, that was funny, but then it just felt like it got ugly. And at the end, I just didn't love the way it ended. If you heard it, we'll talk about it at the Hangout. Maybe I'll play some clips from it and we can discuss it. I think it'll be an interesting conversation. He's one of the greatest comedians of all time, one of my favorites of all time. I didn't love it. I definitely had some really good laughs. I thought there were some really great things, some very funny things. I thought the performance was pretty great. I mean, better than almost anybody else probably could do in that situation live. But I'd love to know what you thought about it if you watched it. But let's get to some other important news stories quickly. Did you hear that a Florida Republican state senator has put forward a bill that would require bloggers to register with the government? The Office of Legislative Services is a commission on ethics in the state. It's not been well received, including by conservatives. And I just thought that was a really interesting story to mention, because when Newt Gingrich blasts a Republican idea, I think that's important. He wrote, the idea that bloggers criticizing a politician should register with the government is insane. It's an embarrassment that a Republican state legislator in Florida would introduce a bill to that effect. He should withdraw it immediately. Well, that is the Florida Republican Party for you. So we'll see if that goes anywhere. I mentioned and want to mention again one more time that a new report goes into shocking detail about Fox News' tailspin after 2020 election and how Brett Baer and Martha McCallum, who are supposed to be their serious, objective journalists, never are. But never are. Both of them. It's ridiculous to say that they even are. Anyway, they were worried for the network's ratings after their own analysts correctly determined Donald Trump was on track to lose. And that New York Times article is really, really outrageous and important reporting. President Biden was in Selma on Sunday to make remarks commemorating Bloody Sunday. 58 years ago, and President Biden vowed to strengthen U.S. voting rights. Here he is on the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
I come here in commemoration, not for show. Selma is a reckoning. The right to vote, to have your vote counted, is the threshold of democracy and liberty. With it, anything's possible. Without it, without that right, nothing is possible. And this fundamental right remains under assault. We must remain vigilant. In January, I signed the Electoral Count Reform Act to protect the will of the people and the peaceful transfer of power. We know that we must get the votes in Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. I made it clear, I will not let a filibuster obstruct the sacred right to vote. the right of any other right to vote from there. And that's why you follow the words that you all have, the words of Dr. King. He said, give us the ballot, or we will place judges on the bench who will do justly. Led by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, and more black women appointed to the federal appellate court than every other president in history has done. We're about to do that.
There you go. President Biden yesterday in Selma, Alabama, commemorating the 58th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and revisiting the issue of voting rights, which was good to see. And did you hear this, or did you see this? Steven Spielberg sat down with Stephen Colbert, and I thought this was pretty interesting and went very viral, and I thought I would share it with you, just in case you missed it.
Young Sam, and I assume young Steven Spielberg, is bullied and feels alienated by his Jewishness. And you've said it took years for you to embrace your heritage, and not doing so fully until you were actually making Schindler's List. With the profits of the film, you created the Shoah Foundation. And I'm curious, as someone who's examined his own Jewishness in the place of Jews, not only in the United States, but around the world, do you find it surprising, the rise of public anti-Semitism, not only in the United States, but in authoritarian countries all around the world now?
I find it very, very surprising, because anti-Semitism has always been there. It's either been just around the corner and slightly out of sight, but always lurking, or it has been much more overt, like in Germany in the 30s. But not since Germany in the 30s have I witnessed anti-Semitism no longer lurking, but standing proud with hands on hips like Hitler and Mussolini, kind of daring us to defy it. I've never experienced this in my entire life, especially in this country.
Well, that is quite sobering to hear. Steven Spielberg with Stephen Colbert. But let me bring the mood back and a few laughs from Saturday Night Live Weekend Update with Michael Che and Colin Jost.
Tennessee Governor Bill Lee has signed a new law banning public drag performances with a 6-year prison sentence for repeat offenders. As first predicted in the now documentary, Medea Goes to Jail. A Tennessee state senator said the bill will prevent kids from being, quote, blindsided by a sexualized performance in public. What are you talking about? Drag shows don't just pop up like flash mobs and sprinkle gay dust on your kids. I never accidentally happened upon a drag show, and I grew up in New York City. Now, I have been blindsided by a sexualized performance a few times, but that's just what you get when you take the bus.
The U.S. Energy Department concluded that COVID likely originated from a Wuhan laboratory leak and not a wet market. So I gave up eating bats for nothing? Newspapers around the country dropped the cartoon strip Dilbert after creator Scott Adams said he chose to live in a community where no black people live. So he lives in your building, huh, Colin?
Newspapers dropped the cartoon strip effective immediately, and to rub it in, they're replacing Dilbert with Peanuts' Oops All Franklin. Dilbert creator Scott Adams' racist rant was in response to the results of a poll that asked respondents the question, is it okay to be white? Oh, I'd say it's more than just okay.
The House Ethics Committee has announced an investigation into George Santos. Well, thank God I'm not George Santos, said George Santos. Donald Trump accused Ron DeSantis of wanting to cut Social Security and Medicare and called the Florida governor a wheelchair over the cliff kind of guy. Wheelchair over the cliff is also how Melania will finally get rid of him. First Lady Jill Biden said in an interview that she maintains a good balance in the types of advice she offers President Biden, but it's mostly hold on to the railing.
This week, South Carolina attorney Alex Murdaugh was found guilty of murder and also found guilty of looking like Will Ferrell dressed as Conan O'Brien.
All right, there they go. There's some laughs. Oops, All Franklin was my favorite there. Colin Jost, Michael Chase, Saturday Night Live weekend update. All right, well, what else? That's it. How about we get to my guest, shall we? Oh, wait, this is breaking right now. Washington, D.C.'s weirdest marriage is over. Oh, this is sad news. Page 6 is New York Post everywhere now reporting that Kellyanne Conway, the longtime advisor of former President Donald Trump, and George Conway, the longtime tormentor of President Trump, have decided to divorce after 22 years of marriage. Beltway insiders tell the Post they both lawyered up and that the two sides are hashing out the details of the split. You hate to see it. You hate to see it. It seemed like that was really going to work out. All right, I'm a dick. All right, let's get to my first and only guest on today's show. He is the founder and CEO of a financial firm called Hermitage Capital. It was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005. But since 2009, when his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was murdered in prison after uncovering a $230 million fraud committed by Russian government officials, Bill Browder has been leading a campaign to expose Russia's endemic corruption and human rights abuses. Before founding the firm, he was the vice president at another one, Salomon Brothers. He's got a bachelor's degree in economics. He's got an MBA from Stanford Business School. He's written 2 books now about this, which I mentioned earlier, Red Notice and Freezing Order. You can follow him on Twitter, and I hope you'll let him know that you heard him here on the show. He's a really important guy, a very important voice, and a great guest to have on the show, which is why you should subscribe to it, because we get amazing guests like this every day. Go to standupwithpete.com and do that now. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Browder. Bill Browder joins me again. Very, very grateful when I get the opportunity to talk to you. One of the most important people on this issue. Thank you for joining me. How have you been? How has your year been?
Well, I think it's been pretty bad, actually. I mean, I'm sitting in London. We're watching a war taking place in Europe for the first time in many decades. Russia is killing people en masse in Ukraine. It's like September 11th for the Ukrainians every day. Vladimir Putin is like Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden times 365. And, it's hard to walk around feeling good about things when this mass murder is taking place so close to home.
Yes, very well said. Bill, tell me about your friend Vladimir Kara-Murza.
For anyone who's followed my story, I've spent the last decade advocating for something called the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act is a piece of legislation named after my Russian lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was tortured for 358 days in Russian police custody and murdered back in 2009. And I've been on a mission to get justice for him. And I've been going around the world meeting with parliaments and governments, trying to get the assets frozen and the visas canceled of people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and people who do other types of crimes. And one of my most important collaborators has been a Russian citizen named Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir was a member of the Russian opposition. He was a protege of the leader of the Russian opposition, a guy named Boris Nemtsov, who some people may remember was murdered in front of the Kremlin. And Vladimir is literally traveled the world with me to the U.S. Congress, to the Canadian Parliament, to the Swedish Parliament, to the French Parliament, British, European, all over the place. And as I would tell the story of what happened to Sergei and the need for sanctions, Vladimir would share from a Russian perspective, the Russian opposition perspective. He would explain this is something that Russian people want, that the Russian opposition wants, so that the Russian opposition, they don't like their leaders. Russia doesn't want their leaders to be stealing money and killing people. And his voice was extremely important, very powerful. He was an unbelievable orator, very charismatic. I would compare him to a young Nelson Mandela or Václav Havel.
Wow.
And we both had success. We got 35 countries to pass the Magnitsky Act, and the Russian government, Putin, hated him with all their heart, and they tried to kill him. in Moscow with poison. He was poisoned in the summer of 2015. And he went into coma. He had multiple organ failure. His doctors pretty much wrote him off. They said he had a 5% chance of survival. But somehow his will to live overcame the poison, and he eventually came out of the coma and took a long time to recover and rehabilitate after such a ordeal, but he got better. And then they poisoned him again in 2017. And after the war started, I had dinner with him in London. His family lives outside of Washington. He travels back and forth to Russia. He's a big character in my book, Freezing Order. And the book was about to be launched in April. And I was having dinner with him and his wife in London after the book, or actually just before the book had come out, after the war had started. And I said to him, hey, it'd be really good if you could come and speak at my book launch. I think you have a lot to say and people would want to hear it.
Sure.
And he said, I'd love to. And I will be there, but I'm just going to Moscow first. And I said, oh my God, you can't go to Moscow. The war has started. They tried to kill you twice. You're one of the most hated and reviled people in the country as far as Putin is concerned. You just can't go. They'll kill you, or at best they'll arrest you. And he said to me, how can I not go? I'm asking the Russian people to stand up to Putin. If I'm too afraid to go back to my own country, then what message does that send to the people? And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, I understand your position, but at the same time, I don't want you to be, harmed or killed or arrested. And he wouldn't listen to anything I said. He went back to Russia. He went and did an interview on CNN and MSNBC. He called Putin a murderer on CNN. And an hour after the CNN interview, the police were outside his house. They arrested him. They put him in jail where he sits today. And 3 days from now, on March 6th, he's going to be going on trial for high treason. He's facing a 24-year sentence. The only crime was calling out Putin, calling him a murderer, and calling the war a war. And I think in a certain way, his story demonstrates how terrible everything is in Russia for the Russian people, how scared Putin is of any type of dissent, and how barbaric the whole story is out there.
I'm so thankful for you for sharing that, talking about him, introducing him, working with him. And I'm so terribly sorry to hear of what's happened. And more specifically, you just tweeted a couple days ago that he is in prison and now experiencing some real serious health issues, numbness in his limbs after being held for 3 days in a, quote, punishment cell in this trial detention. And of course, you mentioned he's still frail from the 2 poisoning attempts organized by the Russian FSB. So, I mean, he's in pretty bad shape, it sounds like, right now.
Yeah, it's really horrifying. And I spoke to his wife about this, and after, the poison that they gave him, we believe, was Novichok. In fact, we know that the same individuals who poisoned Alexei Navalny with Novichok, they were found to have been trailing him before he was poisoned. And so we have to assume that the same individuals used Novichok on him. Novichok causes extreme nerve damage. And as he was recovering from his first Novichok poisoning, he couldn't feel his limbs before. And his wife was telling me that the treatment for that is to effectively go to the beach and walk on shells, really sharp shells. So it creates feeling and causes the nerves to start sending messages. And he was in the sunlight. They were on the beach. They walked on shells, and eventually his feeling came back. He's in prison right now. They put him in this, quote, punishment cell. I don't even know what that means, but I don't think it means anything good. And there's no treatment. They're denying him treatment. And on top of that, the people who are persecuting him are all the same people who were involved in Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer's persecution, who was murdered. Dmitry Komnov is the head of the prison. He was the head of the prison that Magnitsky was in.
Oh, wow.
The judge who is going to be judging him on the trial is the same judge that did all sorts of nasty stuff in the court to Sergei Magnitsky. And the prosecutor, Alexander Bastrykin, was the same person in charge of the Magnitsky case. And so this is just same cast of murderous characters, same torturers who killed Sergei Magnitsky are now doing the same thing to Vladimir Karamurza, and it's very worrying. And he is one of the true heroes of our time. He really is. There is absolute. He's a black and white story. He's really the sort of saint of Russia. If Russia was run by a guy like him, there would be no war. There would be reparations. Russia would be stopping all the stuff. There would be prosecutions of all these crimes. It would be a totally different story. But instead, we have this mass murdering psychopath, Vladimir Putin, who really is like Osama bin Laden times 365.
Yeah, I mean, there can be no comparison between a terrorist leader of a small group of terrorists, ideologically driven, with the funds and resources they have, versus Vladimir Putin or any state leader of any time, really, because he's got an entire legitimate government. They're part of the UN. I mean, I'm glad that you're comparing them, but there is, and you're using the whatever exponential 300. But I mean, there's no way to compare these two. I don't think.
The reason I bring up Osama bin Laden is because he was hated all over the world. He was defined as a monster. Whereas they're having 100,000 people marching in Germany saying, Ukraine should capitulate and negotiate with this man. They would never have marched and say, well, we should all negotiate with Osama bin Laden. But that's the message, Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene are sending out there, that, Putin is somehow a legitimate leader of a sovereign state that they even support. And what, the reason I use this bin Laden comparison, because he's much worse than bin Laden, and all these characters somehow treat him like he's a legitimate head of state.
Have you ever reached out to any of the Republican critics in Congress of our support for this war to give them a little bit of a lesson? Have you reached out to them? Have you talked to any of them?
I have not, and I know these types of people because I've dealt with them, these types of people in the past, and they're not doing this out of integrity and honesty and a false belief. It's not like you can convince them otherwise. There's something corrupt in their view. I don't know how the corruption came about, but it's not like you can say, just look at the facts. This is an unreasonable position. You should change your position. And then say, oh, actually, I didn't know that. Now I will change my position. These people are firmly entrenched in their position. It's either political corruption, bribery, or blackmail. There's no.
To some extent, it's probably something even more, to some extent, insidious, in that they have zero morals, and it just so happens that the guy in the White House is for it, and so why not just be against it, just to create a divide?
Well, I'm not even sure. Perhaps, but that's a generous view, and maybe that's what it is. But it's just so evil. It's hard to. It's just hard to get your head around.
And you don't think that it's worth even trying to convince them. So, what about the concern that they and plenty of other people talk about, that we won't be able to? And I think Putin and his allies are banking on that the American public, that the West won't continue to support this war, that we will get weary, that we will get exhausted, that we will give up. What do you say? What do you think is the most convincing message to the American public or taxpayer, to NATO in the West, to Germans? What do you think is the best message to send those people who are maybe getting weary at this point, much less might be at any point?
Well, I understand the weariness. Of course, we're all weary. Nobody chose this war. Putin chose this war. We don't want it by any means, and we wish it was not happening. But what we should understand, and this is where I can bring some perspective, is I've spent the last 13 years in a man-to-man fight with Vladimir Putin over the Magnitsky Act. He's tried to kill me. He's tried to kill people close to me. As I mentioned, Vladimir Karamurza. There are others, and I know how he behaves. And Putin is not a guy who's ever going to compromise, back down, negotiate. And so from his perspective, what he wants to do is finish off Ukraine and then move further west. And if he moves further west, he'll be at a border of a country where we have a treaty obligation, like Poland or Estonia, where we have an obligation, where we're supposed to, they're members of NATO, where we're supposed to defend them. And let me tell you something. If we're tired of spending money at this rate, it will be 100 times more expensive if we're in a full-scale military conflict with Russia ourselves. And we will lose people. People will die. Americans will die. British soldiers will die. And so anyone who's tired of what's going on right now should look at the alternative, which is 100 times or 1,000 times worse. Right now, we can spend 5% of the U.S. military budget. We can completely destroy a major malicious adversary without the single loss of an American life. I think it's a pretty good deal, and everybody should just pipe down any of this nonsense and understand that the alternative is just so far worse that we should just gladly accept that the Ukrainians are doing the fighting for us and do everything possible to help them win.
Dave Rothkopf I was talking to him the other day, and he basically said something similar, a little bit more animated. He was basically like, this is a bargain. Are you kidding me? This is an amazing bargain that we're getting, putting it in similar terms as you just did. So, yeah, well, I hope that people don't get weary of it for the reason that you said that, and that message should never stop being said every day. Think about that. So, looking back on a year, Bill, have you been surprised by anything? I was too lazy to go back and look at your predictions.
No, everything that I said a year ago is true. People were hoping for a quick resolution, that this would be over quickly. That hasn't happened. The only thing I'm surprised by is actually how robust the West has become. The West, when I say the West, I mean the United States and Europe and so on. We're always appeasing Putin big time in the previous 20 years and giving him all sorts of mixed messages, like condemning his actions but doing nothing about it, and just all talk, no action. And so the only other thing that's really surprised me is how we've really sort of stepped up to the plate. We've provided military aid to the Ukraine. We've done some pretty serious sanctions. We can do definitely a lot more, and we should do a lot more. The Ukrainians are begging for more weapons. We seem to be sort of drip feeding them in as opposed to putting them in at the rate in which the Ukrainians need them to continue fighting. But it's amazing compared to the first day of the war, when we were saying, well, we shouldn't give them any kind of offensive weapons and so on and so forth. And so I would say, and then of course the other big, huge surprise is how effective the Ukrainians have been on the battlefield. I mean, with duct tape and homemade drones, they've given the Russians an incredible run for the money. According to the Ukrainian tallies, the Russians have lost dead 150,000 soldiers and probably equal number injured. And so they've effectively eviscerated the entire initial invasion force that came to take over Ukraine.
Sanctions. How effective have they been? It's an impossible thing for people to kind of understand.
Well, the sanctions are painful by all means. They're causing great pain in every different layer of Russian society, and particularly the upper layer, the Putin layer, the oligarch layer. All those guys are completely messed up, and that's helpful. But the main problem is that until we cut off the sale of oil and gas from Russia, they don't get the money. They keep on getting like between $500 million and $1 billion a day of money coming into their coffers.
From who? And, India, China,
and us. I mean, people are buying it in the West. They're buying Russian oil and buying Russian gas. We put something called the price cap on, which says they can't sell it for more than $60. But the price is not that much higher than $60 anyways. And so, it's crazy. We're the West, Western Europe and so on, we're giving Russia hundreds of millions of dollars a day. They're using that to kill Ukrainians, and then we're giving the Ukrainians weapons to fight back. Well, we should give the Ukrainians the weapons, not give the Russians any of the money.
Just don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but oil and gas always seems to be behind so much of our world conflict, certainly in the Gulf and Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And I mean, energy independence would solve so much for so many, would it not?
Well, the United States can be energy independent and more or less is. I mean, the United States is, I think, a net exporter of energy.
Yeah.
But the problem is that the United States is one country in the world, and there's a lot of other countries that are allies to the United States that are not energy independent. And so, until, I have a fantasy, which is one day hydrogen or wind or solar or all combination of those things or nuclear will replace the need for hydrocarbons. And all these nasty regimes from Saudi Arabia to Russia to Venezuela to Iran will all basically go out of business because oil seems to be located in the most odious countries. And so it would be really nice to see those places.
There's a correlation there. I don't know if oil makes them odious or if they're odious and they're selling it. But yeah, that's certainly true. The other thing that you've been advocating for is confiscating the funds, and you've talked about what you would do with them. It sounds like that would be a very, very hard thing to do because you would have to get several other countries on board and you would have to change laws to be able to do it. What is this idea?
Well, so a week after the war started, the U.S. and other allies froze $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves. This is the money that belongs to the Russian state. Putin had accumulated a pretty big war chest of $650 billion. He made the mistake of keeping more than half of that at the U.S. Federal Reserve, at the Bank of England, at the European Central Bank, and that money has now been frozen. The war has started. He's executed this war in the most sadistic and violent way, and based on recent estimates, it's created $1.2 trillion of damage to the Ukrainian economy and their infrastructure. And so, how do we fix the problem? How do we fix the damage? Well, in my opinion, and it seems pretty straightforward. The first pot we should dip into before we dip into our own pockets is that Russia should pay for it. Putin should pay for it.
Right.
And so we have custody of the money. That money shouldn't just be frozen. It should be confiscated. And now it's not as easily said. It's not as easy as just confiscating it because it belongs to the sovereign state of Russia. Russia is protected by a legal concept called sovereign immunity. And so in order to seize that money, we have to do it lawfully, which means we have to change the law to make it possible to do that. And you're right, it's hard to change laws. Having said that, I'm probably one of the...
Yeah, you've done it.
I'm one of the most experienced people in the world at doing this. I got the Magnitsky Act passed in 35 countries. And so, as I look at this heartbreaking and just infuriating mass murder that's taking place and that Putin is doing, like everyone else, I want to do something. And the one thing I can bring to the party is my experience passing the Magnitsky Act and applying it towards this $350 billion. And so that's my big project, is to try to bust through all the bottlenecks. And there's a lot of them because, it's really interesting that, it's a huge damage done to Ukraine. And you get all these bureaucrats in the State Department and the British Foreign Office saying, well, this just can't be done. And sovereign immunity is sacrosanct. And I'm saying, well, the rule of law is good and sovereign immunity is good, but Putin has redefined international crime. He's, redrawn the borders. He's broken the law in such an extreme way. Don't we need to upgrade our laws to take into account what he's done?
Are there no? Yeah, as I was learning about this, preparing to talk to you, sovereign immunity idea and how hard that must be, all I could think was, and didn't have the time to really look into it, was the historical precedent of it. Did we not do this after World War II? Have we not done this with other countries? Not only we, but at the UN and internationally, has this been done in the past when it's sacrosanct? I understand, but you've just invaded another country. I mean, should that have been done to the U.S. when we invaded Iraq? That was arguably a pretty horrific crime.
Well, it absolutely applied in World War II. We seized the assets of Nazi Germany, but the difference between that and this is that they were defeated, and that the war is still going on here, and we're not actually at war with Russia.
Right.
And so it creates a slightly different set of circumstances. But I think that it's totally reasonable to upgrade international law to take into account this set of circumstances, because what Putin can't just go and mass murder people and cause this type of destruction and then say, well, actually, but you have to obey the law. The law needs to be adjusted for this type of situation. And it's not us becoming lawless in doing this. It's just us saying, well, actually, the laws are based on an old set of assumptions, which we can't assume are the case anymore. And by the way, one of the unexpected consequences of doing this is, who's the other country that has a lot of foreign exchange reserves sitting out there? China. Maybe this will send a message to China. If you go after Taiwan, you're going to lose your central bank reserves held abroad as well.
What about, lastly, Vladimir Putin himself? I just read about his big rally where he had to pay people apparently to come. And there seems to be a lot of support. It's hard for me to tell. You can tell me what your thoughts are and how that's even tracked accurately. But you've talked openly about what would happen if he was taken out, if he was assassinated, if he died. This does seem to have always been driven by him, and very few, like you can count on one hand of his yes men. And it seems like a lot of the other folks' leadership in Russia thought this was a terrible idea, and turns out it was. So what is the current Russian public support? What happens if Putin is gone? Do you think he will be? How come he hasn't been?
I don't think he'll be gone anytime soon. He's very good at staying alive. He's like, everyone is so scared of him, you can't even imagine. And the Russian people are scared of him. I mean, I was just interviewed by a big Russian TV personality earlier today, and she was moaning about how bad the sanctions were and how upset people were, and they weren't involved in the war. And I'm saying, well, every one of you is involved in the war by supporting Putin. And she said, well, we're just too scared to step up. And I said, well, maybe you have a duty to step up. You can't just sit there and try to look after your own interests. You have a murderous dictator who's killing people in a neighboring country. It's your duty as a Russian not to complain about sanctions, but to step up. And so people are scared to death of him. Everybody is scared to death. So I don't think he's going to be killed. I don't think he's going to be taken out by the oligarchs or by his own people. He's very good at staying in power. And I think that the Russian his propaganda has now been so pervasive that anyone stepping into, if he were somehow to die in his sleep, anyone stepping into his shoes will end up doing the same thing. Because how do you can't say, oh, never mind, everything we've just told you for the last year, all the sacrifice, all the death is for nothing. Never mind. I just don't see how they can do that. The genie's out of the bottle now. People are frothing at the mouth with nationalism.
Oh, God, I hate to hear that. I thought for some reason if someone took over, they could change the message. They could somehow justify ending the war.
If Vladimir Karamurza took over as the next leader of Russia, then it would be all good. But they're slowly trying to torture him to death in prison.
I've also had a hard time understanding how, and maybe it's not being reported, maybe they don't really understand it, but how many Russian soldiers have been killed. I mean, what is the value of those lives? How does that, if anything, affect public opinion on this war the way it would certainly in the U.S. And I think probably a lot of other countries?
Russia's a dictatorship. There's nobody voting for Putin to be continuing on in his job. Right. And so public opinion doesn't matter. Remember, Stalin lost 25 million. In a dictatorship, Hitler lost, millions and millions. These people don't care about the death of soldiers, and Putin has lost 150,000 young men, and he could lose another 150 and another 150, and he wouldn't have a hard time sleeping, and it wouldn't make his heart beat any faster.
Anything you want to say here at the end? Silver lining, something about the Ukrainian fight?
Well, the one thing I would say is that don't count the Ukrainians out. Right. They are fighting. They have such an important fight to fight, which is their survival. Their wives don't get raped, so their children don't get snatched away, so that the men don't get tortured and castrated in Russian prison camps. They've got a really good reason to fight, and they will fight. And they'll take drones that were made for cameras and put on hand grenades and use them as improvised bombers. I mean, it's the Ukrainians are really very, very good at what they do, and don't count them out. They have a good chance.
Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing, for continuing to be obviously a strong voice and critic, and I really appreciate whenever I get the opportunity to talk to you. Thanks so much, Bill.
Thank you.
All right. Bill Browder. How about it? Bill Browder on Twitter. Go say hello to him. Go get his books. Go read what he's writing and follow him closely. I think his voice, his point of view, just so valuable on this issue. Bill Boyle loves him. Listeners love him. Intense dude. And I've met him a couple times, several times in person, and he's always been really, really cool to me. So go say hello to him on Twitter. Go get his books. And that's it, folks. That's all I've got for you. Who would you like to hear on this week's show? Let me know. Thank you very much to Jon Carroll. Thank you to Odessa Son. Thank you to Pete Coe. Thank you to everybody listening to the show. I'll give you subscriber shout-outs tomorrow. Sorry I didn't do that today. And I look forward to hearing from you. standupwithpete@gmail.com. Go rate, review the show on Spotify, iTunes, subscribe, standupwithpete.com. That's it. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up, stand up. Got to stand up. Ooh, come on, just stand up. Everybody got to stand up in the darkest